Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Mr. Rai, you have been making films for 25 years now. How did you respond to the Indian film situation when you started making films?
I think you're referring to films of the late 40s and 50s.
50s.
Well, as a student of the cinema, you see, we had started our film society at that time. I was naturally interested in what was happening here locally. But I'm afraid I didn't find much that I found inspiring, if you know what I mean. I mean, there was a certain degree of competence, but there was also a great deal of the theatre in our films, and not much adventure by way of themes, or no sign of real sort of probing into reality. You know, it was all a slightly manufactured kind of cinema.
Have you any explanation for this kind of apathy or not being able to respond to what was happening abroad at the same time?
I think the cinema was more or less made for the public of that time, or at least the conception of the public as the makers had. And even then, I think a certain kind of formula was being used. For instance, I mean, I can remember two broad kinds of films. One which would be based on fairly rooted regional subjects, like, let us say, a film on Chundidar, or a film on a Sharat Chandra story, or Bankim Chandra story. And another, which one found in some of the new theatres films of that period, was a film ostensibly about social subjects, but again, in structure and theme and content, rather superficial and sort of formula bound. I mean, there would be a little bit of social awareness, a little bit of romance, a little bit of upper class, a little bit of the peasantry. I'm thinking of films like Deshimati and all that, you know. So that, I'm afraid, I didn't find very exciting. Naturally, there weren't very many films to see in those days. The industry was much smaller. So one could get to see most of the films that were being made. But I drew my inspiration from the films of the West. Definitely.
What films in particular?
Well, in my early days, of course, I was exposed primarily to American and British films, mainly American, I must say.
Hollywood.
What?
Hollywood.
Well, Hollywood, yes, Hollywood. But a very good kind of Hollywood. I think 40s was a very rich period in Hollywood, when the big names that we know now, John Ford, Wyler, Capra, Lubitsch, and they were all working. And we can call it the classical period of the American cinema. And they were well-made films on interesting subjects, very, very well acted, edited, photographed. And one could learn, as a student of the cinema, one could learn a lot from them. And obviously, I was lapping them up, and I learned my technique from just watching these foreign films. We were not yet exposed to the continental cinema to that extent. That came later. But American cinema, mainly.
Has become, in certain senses at least, easier for you since the 50s.
Well, a lot of things have happened over the last 25 years. I have learned more. I think I have greater control over the medium. But not everything has improved, in the sense that technically we are still very backward. In fact, I would say that we had better equipments when we made, for instance, when I made my trilogy. We had better equipments, better film stock, better processing was being done in the labs. The cameras were more reliable in those days. Whereas now, the studios are not nearly as well maintained as they used to be in those days. And some of the cameras, for instance, some of the cameras that we used at the time of Jal Shaghar or Purajito are still being used now. And we have to use the same cameras, you see, and they are obviously not performing as well as they used to in the old days. And the stock situation is a problem. So there are problems, you see. Perhaps it's easier for me to find a producer, find a backer. But technically, I think we are backwards now. We have gone backwards from that time, really. It's a very odd situation where
But I think you have more options now. Why don't you opt to go out of Bengal and do your films elsewhere? Why do you stick here?
Well, I stick here because there is a sort of challenge in being able to make respectable films in the circumstances that we work here, and in the circumstances of privation, of lack. After all, we have good technicians here. For instance, an art director, even in a studio which is falling to pieces, can build a very convincing and a very beautiful set. And the cameras, after all, take pictures, don't they? And we have editors. We have editing machines which are very old, but one can still use them and edit films in them. And I have been making more and more films in color, as you know. Color is more reliable, although we don't have color labs here. But color stock is much more reliable, and we get our work done in the DRAS. So there is this continuing challenge. Of course, it's becoming a little difficult now. It's a bit too tough at times. I feel that. But again, I love working here. I love Bengal. I love there are still a lot left to do here by way of stories, themes. So I don't think I shall leave Bengal that easily.
Only a few months back, Sir Richard Attenborough was in town,
Yes.
working for your Shatranj, and I had occasion to ask him what he found specially important working with you.
Cinema, I've never really felt is a totally true art form. I think theatre is. I don't think the cinema is. I think it's a semi-art form. I think it's a craft. I think one of the reasons I feel that is that the delegation of the creation is so much. There is a director, yes. He has a cameraman, and he has an art director, and he has actors, and he has writers, and he has composers, etc., and camera operators, etc., etc. I think the extraordinary thing about Manikda, as I've been allowed to call him since I've been here, is that he performs so many of those functions. He writes the screenplay, he composes the music, he directs it, he operates the camera, he half lights the set. Certainly he works with the lighting cameraman in such detail that any source of light or change that he wants, he gets. He edits his own films, almost as Chaplin did.
He's even so firm about what he wants from the actor.
I'm afraid he is.
And very
As absolutely, and his interest and almost what's the phrase I want? Obsession with detail means that he puts 90% of what there is onto that screen.
Your involvement in every separate aspect of the making of a film has been a slow and gradual thing. When you started, you were not working on all the aspects of the cinema. Why and how did you decide to take on every element of the film one by one?
Well, actually, it's not every element really, but most of the elements, I think. In the early days, for instance, at the time of the trilogy and Opushanka, I was doing the screenplay. I was directing, of course, and I used to get visual ideas for sets and things like that. I did my own casting because I had very clear ideas of the kind of actors that I wanted for certain parts. I did my own casting, and then at the time of editing, I didn't operate the camera at that time, and I didn't write the music. At the time of editing also, I was there, very much there, and the films were more or less, as the expression goes, cut in the camera, so there wasn't a great deal left for the editor to do, but of course I've had a very creative editor helping me. But later on, for instance, I took over operating
Since when?
since the time of Charulata. You see, I decided that the camera, it was through the camera that one was able to judge the action and the movement of the actors best, rather than sitting in a chair by the side. And I found it helped the actors also, because I was behind the camera, you know, they couldn't see me actually. It helped them. They felt easier. And in the early days, I worked with, on music, I worked with professional, I wouldn't say professional composers, but professional musicians. I mean, I worked with Ravi Shankar on 4 of my films. But they were essentially instrumentalists. They were performers, concert performers. They were not trained film composers. So that for instance, they were not trained to write music which would run for 2 minutes and 7 seconds and things like that, you see. So it was always a problem working, although they were very inventive. Ravi Shankar in particular devised some beautiful music for the trilogy. And I was very happy to use them. But the method that I used was that they would come, maybe just for a day or a couple of days. They would be, the rest of the time they were touring all over the world, if not all over India. And they would be available for, let us say, 2 days or 3 days, in which time they would probably have one look at the film, not even the whole film. For instance, Ravi Shankar saw only half of Pathimachali. And they would write certain specific pieces. And the rest of the time, I was interested more in using their instruments. I was interested in Ravi Shankar's sitar. I was interested in Ali Akbar Sarod, and interested in certain ragas which I knew would fit certain situations. So I had them perform maybe for 3 minutes, 4 minutes at a stretch, various ragas in various moods and various tempos. And later on, it meant a tremendous lot of work in the cutting room for me, trying to fit the music with the scenes. So finally, in around 1960, at the time of Pinkonna, I decided to do my own music.
Has the change or the variety of themes which you have adopted later been also a factor in this choice that you have to rely on your own music? In the earlier films, for example, you had more of a freedom, more of a going back into the romantic world of the village. And later on, you have been concerned with other forms and other sorts of experiences.
Yes, that is true, because more and more I felt that I needed, for instance, when you are doing a theme which is concerned with urban, the contemporary urban society, you can't use conventional classical Indian music instruments like the sitar and sarod. They just don't go with the theme. So I decided to use a combination of Western and Eastern instruments. And I had always been interested in Western music, and I was also familiar with the Western style of notation. So I decided, and since I was getting too many ideas of my own, it's not always very satisfactory to have to dictate great musicians like Vilayat Khan and Ali Akbar. And it threatened our friendship on a personal level, so I decided to do it on my own. And now more and more I use less and less music, I find, because I can use the mixing facilities have improved, and I can use a more creative soundtrack whereby one can use actual sounds almost as you use music to suggest moods and things like that.
Would you give some instances, or maybe one instance of what you call this creative use of sound in your recent works? Something that...
Well, for instance, in a city story, you can use in a Calcutta story in John Arun. Actually, the city itself provided the noise of traffic and that sort of thing, and it's provided the sound, the mood building soundtrack. You know, I can't think of any specific examples offhand, but in Oshani Sanket, which one could well have used folk music in abundance. But I prefer to use bird noises. I prefer to use the sound of dheki, you know,
Right.
that sort of thing. And I prefer to use wind noises and other extraneous. I used one particular bird, the woodpecker, which I recorded. I was lucky to be able to record one. And it comes at a very crucial point when Moti dies, you know. At that point, when she is lying on the ground with her eyes, staring eyes, and hold the camera for about 5, 6, 7 seconds on that face, we can hear the woodpecker going, which is a very shrill, rather alarming kind of, rather eerie sort of sound. And I thought I felt that use of music would sentimentalize the scene, so I decided to use this, which was also a realistic sound as well as a kind of a stylization of
Symbolic
sound.
also at a certain level. At one time, your films were associated with actors that you had discovered and molded for your films. But you have actually dealt with all sorts of actors, with old professionals, veterans, newcomers, artists that you have discovered, children, even animals in certain cases. How have you worked with these various sorts of actors? Have you followed any single method, the kind of method that Soumitra describes, or have you adopted various methods for the various sorts of actors you have handled?
Well, actually, I started using professionals fairly early on, if you remember, because after Pather Bachelin Oporigito came Porospator and
You had
Jal Shagar.
Tulsi Chakraborty.
So I had used Tulsi Chakraborty and I had used Chobi Biswas. Chobi Biswas was a very, very special case because he was really a very, very big professional actor at that time, probably the biggest character actor on the Bengali screen of that period. And I had some problems in the early stages, like, for instance, in Jal Shagar, in the portions which show him as a young man, he insisted on doing his own makeup, which was, I'm afraid, 100% theatre makeup. And being a newcomer, a comparative newcomer, and being new to Chobi Biswas, I couldn't do anything about it. So all that portion which shows him as a young man remains a very theatrical sort of makeup. That stays in the film as a blemish. But I got used to Chobi Babu and he got used to me in a very short time. And when I made the second film with him, Debi, he was so cooperative, and so one uses different methods with different actors. One with professionals who are competent. Another method with professionals who are not so competent, where you handle them almost as amateurs. That has happened too. And a third method with newcomers who are talented, and a fourth method with newcomers who are not talented, whom I cast for their face and voice, perhaps, just for these two qualities which fit a certain character. And yet a fifth and sixth methods, fifth with gifted children and the sixth method with not so gifted children. So I have used all kinds, and I still keep on using all these 6 methods for my actors.
There are directors who insist that they would not like to involve their actors in the making of the film in any way. They would give instructions, they would pass orders, and it is for the actors to work out the things.
Well,
Do you follow any such rigid principle?
if an actor has a very, very large part, like, for instance, Oppo in the trilogy, or let us say Pratidwandi, the main actor, who is throughout the film, or with Chobi Babu in Jal Shagar, and in many of these films which are dominated by 1 or 2 or 3 characters, I usually they're naturally given the script well beforehand, so they have time to learn their lines. And in addition to that, if they show an interest in discussing the part with me, to find out the motivations, to be more clear about how it should be played, I'm perfectly willing to oblige them, and I do that. I have had sessions with various actors, even with Richard Attenborough before he actually started shooting. We spent a whole day discussing the part together. So that is there. But some actors have not shown any interest, in spite of the fact that they have been given very large parts, big parts to play. For instance, Shoilin Mukherjee in Charlotte, he said, Manikda, you just do what you like. I don't know anything. Of course, he was just being modest. But this has also happened. And so since I usually have the film in my head, the whole sweep of the film in my head, and I know what kind of emphasis an actor has to put in certain specific scenes, So even if they are not willing to discuss a part, I'm not terribly concerned, because I think I'm in a position to guide them at all stages.
When you work on your scripts, do you have similar dialogues with the authors when they are available? I don't mean the dead authors on whom you work, but
Well,
authors.
if it has happened in not many cases, because I started with dead authors. And the first living author that that was Parashuram, Parashpathar. And when I had prepared his treatment, I went and saw him and told him what kind of little sort of inventions of my own that I was going to put into the film. And he was terribly excited and very, very happy. And with Tarashankar, it was a different experience, because I told Tarashankar Babu that I would like to make a film of Jal Shagaon. He said, "All right, I'll do the screenplay for you." And I said, "Well, certainly. I would love you. It would be wonderful if you could do the treatment." Then he started doing a treatment. And when he had finished about 3 chapters, I found that he was writing an original story, completely original story, which had almost nothing to do with the short story. So I said, "No, Tarashankar Babu, I'm interested in your short story, so let me do a treatment." So that was that. But I never had a chance to discuss with him after the film opened what he thought of the film. But then I've discussed the films with projects with Narendranath Mitra, for instance. He entirely approved of Mahanagar. And by and large, Shankar has approved of his treatments. But I think an actor really would ideally prefer a literal translations of their stories. And there, I can sense that there is a certain element of dissatisfaction, even in their approval. I've noticed that. But this doesn't apply to all the writers that I'm thinking of. For instance, Shunil didn't like his version of, my version of Aranya Din Ratri, but he wholeheartedly approved of all the changes that I made in the next film that I did, Pratidandi. And, well, this has been more or less the case.
Has your attitude towards the actual original works been the same when you have been working with Rabindranath's script, or with Bibhuti Bhushan Banerjee's script, or with the more contemporary authors?
Well, it's not that one makes changes because just for the fun of it. Or, I mean, it's one usually has a much more serious reason for it. And I personally can't think of a single instance of even a classic which has been translated successfully into cinema as being totally unchanged from its original form, because a writer, an author, doesn't write with the film medium in mind at all. And I think certain changes are inevitable. Even with Rabindranath's, even a small story like Postmaster, I had to make certain rather significant changes. For instance, at the end of Postmaster, the girl, little Ratan, falls at the feet of the postmaster and sort of says, beseeches with him not to go away, or at least take her with him. But I felt that it was a bit Victorian. It might sort of spill over on the screen. It might seem over-emotional or sentimental. So I had her suffer. I had her go through these pangs of, I mean, to the same emotion of suffering, without actually having her fall at his feet. Those changes one has to make. This is a small but significant change. You see, it is an introduction of my attitude into the story as a contemporary artist, you see. And the same thing with Noshtonid also, which structurally, which had marvelous moving elements and a beautiful interrelationship between the 4 or 5 main characters. But it just didn't fall into a cinematic pattern, and I had to make necessary modifications. And this one, I'm afraid, we don't have the tradition of cinematic novel writing here as much as they have in the West,
After you make your script, which I know you you do quite elaborately with great thinking going into it. It's a long process usually. But after you have made the script and you go on to make the film, how far do you move away from the script? Do you improvise a lot?
Well, one improvises quite a bit on location, I find. I have found this. In the studio, you are already, your set is pre-planned and you have 3 walls, or 4 maybe, very seldom, but it's usually 3 walls, all the props in place, and all the movements and etc. are fairly well pre-planned. But on location, you have to make modifications. For instance, a change of climate, a change of weather, a sudden wind rising may dictate as the different camera setup. And all sorts of new ideas come while you're working on location, particularly in an expressive location. In Benares, shooting Aparajito, I had all kinds of ideas occurring at the last moment.
Now, new things, lots of new things.
Lots of new things
Right.
there. And even at the time of shooting, sometimes when you arrive on location, you've probably completed the script at home. After having once visited the location, you have, on the basis of what you've seen, you write your screenplay. But when you go again, maybe the scene has changed because maybe a couple of months have elapsed in the meantime, and the trees look different, and you suddenly look at things from a fresh viewpoint, and you make changes. But broad changes have seldom occurred. The master plan remains the same. The structure broadly remains the same, but dialogue is improvised, actions are improvised. But the basic characters hardly ever change. They are fairly well set beforehand.
Environments have played a very large and significant part in your films. And in certain cases, you have made the environments yourself. In other cases, you have found out environments, chosen environments, and worked there. But all through, you have paid a very great attention to the fact of the environment, the reality, the impact of the environment. How have you actually tried to build your environments? Gone out of your, starting from a story, starting from a theme, and making a choice of an environment. You have not been controlled or limited, I have noticed, within any rigid law
No.
that you would work only in exteriors or only in the studio.
No, for instance, there are certain things that are dictated by circumstances. For instance, when one makes a film about contemporary Calcutta, one should ideally shoot on location in actual interiors. And this is something which happens abroad all the time, because nowadays, for instance, the new wave people, all the French directors, they have practically stopped building sets. They all work on location in actual interiors, apartment interiors, out in the street. But the environment there is different. Here, shooting on location in a city, urban location, can be hell, absolutely. I have had this experience many, many times. But streets, we cannot build in the studio. So we have willy-nilly to shoot in the streets, no matter how many thousands of people gather to watch and get in the way of your work. But interiors, I find, because in order to avoid the problem of dubbing, of post-synchronizing the dialogue, which I always find is a very mechanical process, I prefer to build interiors in the studio, because I think I have sufficiently imaginative and clever art directors who will be able to simulate reality. And I have a sufficiently intelligent and mature cameraman to simulate actual lighting, available lighting. And our studio interiors have fooled many of the best foreign critics. I have spoken to them. They can hardly ever make out which is actual set or which is actual interior. So this has been the case, and this is, as I told you, this is dictated by circumstances. But if a film is laid entirely on location, like, for instance, Kanchenjunga, which was planned to be shot in Darjeeling and entirely outdoors, taking into account the changes of weather that takes place in Darjeeling. And the whole story, I spent a fortnight or so there and observed how the weather keeps changing there. And the whole story was planned to take into account of rising mists disappearing, and the sun coming out, the clouds covering the sun, and the gradual falling of light from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, which is the running time of the film.
And even the changes of moods and the changes of tones were related.
The changes of mood.
certain
This was a very special type of film where the changes of mood were dictated by the changes of actual atmospheric conditions. And I think partly the same method was used also in Arun Din Ratri, which is a similar film, from that point of view, a handful
Which
of
has the
characters.
spirit of the location
Yes,
also
yes.
working within the film. When you go to work in Rajasthan, for example, you've worked on a number of your films there by now,
Yes.
2 of them. What were the special problems you faced there? It's another kind of situation entirely.
But Rajasthan, for instance, if you're working in a city like Jodhpur, as we did in Shonarkella, the same problem as in Calcutta we had to face with a crowd. The crowd who not only want to watch the shooting, but they want to be in the shots. You see, that's the main trouble. If they would stand back and watch, then we can work. But their main tendency is to get within the range of the camera, and that creates problems. That we had the same problem in Jodhpur. But shooting for instance, in Bikaner or certainly in Jaisalmer was very, very simple from that point of view, or in the middle of a desert. It's like shooting in the studio. You have everything under control. You take your extras and you shoot, and the light, you judge the light beforehand, you watch the behavior of the sun beforehand, and arrive on time and shoot and come back. That's that.
Apart from these very special occasions like Rajasthan or like the hill station Kanchenjunga, a large number of your films have been based and rooted in a sense in this city.
Mhm.
And this city has appeared in various shapes, in various moods, in various situations back in the 19th century, right down in the 70s of the 20th century. Almost a history of the city grows through your films. Have you any special attachment to the city, or how does this city appear so very often in your films?
Well, Calcutta has appeared largely predominantly in contemporary urban stories, with the exception perhaps of Charulata, which was a 19th century, mid-19th century. Calcutta is endlessly fascinating, and since I was born and brought up here, it remains a constant source of fascination. But again, I find the idea of making contemporary urban subjects, particularly if they're laid in Calcutta, a bit daunting because of the problems that I told you. So one goes back to the 18th century, maybe once in a while, where one doesn't have to contend with the traffic and the kind of public that gets in the way of satisfactory work. So it's that. But then, as you know, I have also departed from Calcutta once in a while and moved elsewhere, not just in time, but also in setting.
You have been one of the major filmmakers who have returned to making short films again and again. Short films or not so short, non-fictional or non-feature films. Yes. Do you find any special excitement or special sustenance in making films like this? More scope for experimentation, more scope for doing something more to your heart?
Short films have been usually of two kinds, you know. I mean, I have actually filmed short story and kept the films short, like first in Din Konna and the second in Mahapurush Kapurush. And I also made a two-reeler called Two for television, which was written especially for television, for the screen. But I have also made a number of documentaries. Now, I think of myself primarily as a storyteller, as a maker of fiction films. But I have, on the occasions when I made documentaries, they were on subjects which fascinated me, which really drew me, which inspired me, let us say. First, there was a film on Rabindranath for the centenary, and the film on Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, who was my art teacher in Shantiniketan. A remarkable man as well as a remarkable painter, and a film on Bala Saraswati, which was a tribute to a great dancer. But I would like to make more short story films. There's no question of that, because we do have a very rich fund of filmable short stories, which should not be expanded. And in the short story, perhaps a good idea would be to make, let us say, a collection of 3 short stories. One told very fairly conventionally, the long one which comes at the end, but on the other 2, one could make experiments, because it's difficult to make experiments on a large scale in a big film, because the audience, I'm afraid, remains still pretty backward, judging by the success of some of the recent films.
Have you noticed any improvement in general in the state of the audience and the approach of the audience? Certain things that you might not have dared do in the past, which you think would be accepted by the audience now?
Oh, yes.
You'd like to do?
I definitely think that an audience has certainly grown in Calcutta and near sort of suburban places, which are the big towns. There, I personally feel that I have a ready audience for almost any kind of film that I make. Anything that I make will have a 6-week run, let us say, playing in 3 theaters. And this obviously reflects a growing interest in my work. And since my work itself has changed over the years, for instance, in Pratidandi, I tried out all sorts of narrative devices. Even in John Oron, I tried a very sort of ruthless kind of approach, a very a cynical almost approach. Very stark approach, which worked, which went down very well. And I'm very, very optimistic about the state of the audience here. There's no question, although the fact remains that some very, very old-fashioned films are still very, very successful. I think a departure also, something new, which also at the same time tells a story, a significant story, let us say, in a comprehensible, where the communication is effective, should do well.
So what are the dangers or what are the hindrances that you face now? If you think that the audience has improved?
Well, as I told you, mainly technical. It's mainly technical, I think, because we can't use black and white anymore. Honestly, black and white is in a very poor state at the moment because of the stock situation. We have to make films in color. We have to think in those terms now, and color dictates a bigger market because color is much more costly. And when you think of a bigger market, you can't just think of Bengali anymore, which is the reason why I have just made a Hindi film.
Now with this Hindi film, do you expect that it will make a real breakthrough and a dent into the large, massive Indian audience that still remains generally unresponsive to the new Indian cinema?
Well, it remains to be seen. I don't think this is a film for the Sholay audience, frankly. No, because it breaks new ground. I think it's, I've used Premchand's story, which is a short story, where there is a mention of the political event in the background, the annexation of Oudh. But 50%, almost 50% of my film is concerned with the political event itself. And the 2 things run parallel. The short story, Premchand's original, to which I have stuck fairly closely, I think, and the political event, which is, it's like a A-B structure. And at the end, because none of the characters from Premchand's story ever are directly involved in the political thing. But at the end of the film, the thematic link is made very clear, so that it becomes a unity. And I don't think this structure has ever been tried here before. So it is, in a sense, an experimental film. But it is also, I think, a simple film, basically a simple film. And it uses some very well-known and popular Bombay actors who have done marvelous work, I think. I really did enjoy working with these actors and actresses. So, but one waits to see what will happen.
Over these 25 years, you have worked on a wide variety of themes, styles, genres. You have done children's films, fantasy films, realistic films, films based in the 19th century or even an 18th century situation, films right in the 70s, the entire range. Do you still think you have other themes, other genres that haunt you or excite you occasionally, things that you would like to do in the future?
Yes, there are a few things which haven't been done yet. For instance, I've always wanted to do an epic. I had been fascinated by the Mahabharata, and I'm still fascinated by Mahabharata, but I don't think the whole of Mahabharata can be tackled. So perhaps a segment of an epic, a segment of Mahabharata I'd do using our tradition of stylization, perhaps using the Kathakali. I really haven't got a very clear notion of what I want to do, but I definitely do want to do an epic, a story which everybody knows from beforehand. That is something which I want to do.
What are the segments that have...
Well, I think one can make a film on the dice game itself. Just the dice game can make an entire film. The main problem with Mahabharata is the characters. I mean, if one thinks of an Indian audience, then there's no problem, because everybody knows who Karna is and who Bhishma is, etc. But I'm afraid a film of this nature has to be planned for the world market. And there, the relationship of the characters will create tremendous problem, because unless you address a person as uncle, for instance, at least 3 times, he's not uncle. I mean, this is one of the things that one learns over the years. That, and perhaps I would like to do a folk tale at some point. Very much I'd like to do an authentic folk tale, not a Gopi Gain, but an authentic folktale, perhaps based on a Mohan Shingitika ballad, in a very, very simple style with very, very little dialogue, but using, again, Bengali folk forms. I'll continue to make children's films from time to time, that I know. I have decided to do that. And perhaps an English language film involving Indians. Because, you see, if you have people of different provinces getting together in a situation, English is the only lingo that they can use. And that kind of English language film, where the language itself would be used creatively, maybe one person will be very difficult, we're very sort of unvocal because of his lack of command of the language. Another would be very fluent, another would use a certain strong Indian accent. That sort of a situation. It's still very much at the back of my mind, but I don't know what. So there are still a few.
You had a plan to do a science fiction film.
Yes, indeed. I was forgetting about that. That I would very much like to do, but again, that is a question of resources, technical resources. Because now Kubrick's 2001 and a few other films made since then have set such a high standard.
And have extended the horizons of science fiction to infinity.
There's no question of making that kind of a science fiction film here in Bengal. But the idea that I had originally was more of a metaphysical sort of science fiction film, would not involving so much technical expertise and perfection. Perhaps that is one thing I would love to do at some point.
All these 25 years have been a fascinating experience for all of us with your films, and we hope more years of more creative and exciting adventure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.